Order, order. Welcome to Newslaundry's podcast, Reporters Without Orders. This is a podcast where we discuss about what made news, what didn't make news, and what shouldn't definitely have made news. I'm your host this week, Dhanya Rajendran, and joining me are two incredible journalists, Nidhi, Suresh, and Lakshmi Priya. This week will be a bit different because we may not be discussing about what made news, what didn't, and what shouldn't have. Instead, we are going to focus on a story that Nidhi did and Lakshmi Priya edited. It's about a crime which happened in Kerala back in 2017. Now, crimes against women happen almost on a daily basis, somewhere or the other in the country. But there are certain crimes which can impact a society very deeply. And this is what happened in Feb 2017 in Kerala, where a young and popular actor was sexually assaulted in her own moving car. Nidhi went back to the story to look at what is happening in the case. She spoke to people who were involved in the case. In fact, even someone who was accused, two people who were accused in the case, including superstar Dileep of Kerala. She also looked at how the Malayalam film industry has changed over the years and how Kerala society has been grappling with this.
This is a story about one fateful night in Kochi. Criminals on hire, a megalomaniac actor accused of orchestrating a crime, and a female actor who decided to fight. This is a case that shook an industry and divided society.
Nidhi, I know that we've already spoken a lot about the story, even done a video, but my first question to you is that when you started writing about the story, you had told me that a lot of people outside Kerala, even in neighboring states, let's say like Tamil Nadu or Karnataka, were not fully aware of what this case was. And you sit far away in Delhi, so you definitely wanted to write about it. What have the reactions been of people after reading the story? And do you think that your perception was right, that a lot of people were not actually aware of what was happening?
Yeah, the motivation to write this was also to sort of, because of the shock that I felt that people didn't know about the story. And I have now been hearing stories and people have been reaching out. And even today, after it's gone up, people have written in saying that they are also surprised that they haven't heard about this case. They haven't heard about this man. They haven't heard about this sort of movement that happened in Kerala 7 years ago. And for me, it just shows how much of in a silo that we've been reporting, and in different spaces, we don't end up covering news outside of our own immediate line of vision. So it's been satisfying to know that we've been able to do this sort of a long form reportage, to talk about something, look back at how time has changed things, and really also have readers who have never heard about it look at this story and understand the scale of the story.
So for readers who have still not heard about it and may be curious now, they want to go back and read the story, can you explain in a nutshell what this case was all about and where it stands now?
So this particular case begins in 2017, where a top female actor, who in this story we've referred to as Gayatri, so for ease of conversation, I'll also refer to her as Gayatri. She was kidnapped and assaulted by 6 men in a moving car. The assault itself was done by one particular person, Pulsar Sunni, who is now the prime accused in this case. Right after the assault, she filed a case, and then all the 6 men were very quickly caught. But over the next couple of weeks, stories began to emerge that this might have been a conspiracy, that this might have been orchestrated by someone else. And eventually, within a few months, superstar Dileep, who's one of the biggest and well-known names in Malayalam film industry, has been in the industry for the last 2 to 3 decades, was arrested and went to jail for 80 days. But now he's out on bail. The case is still being heard. It's towards the final stages of the trial. And we're hoping, we're looking forward and wanting to know the verdict in this case.
Why was Dileep arrested, Nidhi? Like, what did the cops say was his alleged motive?
So he is being currently accused of masterminding this assault. The motive itself, and we look at this in detail in the story, is revenge. He was angry with Gayatri for interfering in his marital life. At that point, he was married to another actress, Manju Warrior. Now he's married to Kavya Madhavan. But he was angry with Gayatri for interfering with his marital life with Manju Warrior. And it is being said, the police investigations have revealed that the particular incident took place. The crime was conducted because he was angry with her and wanted to shut her up, and that the hope was that she wouldn't go to the police with this. But she did file a case, and now, the men are under arrest. Some are out on bail. The prime accused is still in jail. Dilip is obviously back to work. And for the reason we decided to do this story was the ripple effect that this case had on the industry, right? So we looked at how this one particular case sort of pushed Kerala into, it became kind of a snowballing effect where many women within the industry came out and spoke about abuse, to a point where the state had to, finally take action. They were pushed to take action. The women in the cinema industry formed the Women in Cinema Collective, which is one of the first of its kind in this country. And the most interesting and important thing is that all of this was happening before the world had woken up to the Me Too campaign. So a lot of the women we spoke to told us how, they were almost being looked at as crazy, that the world had not yet woken up to this language of having a conversation about abuse and trauma at workspaces. And so when the Me Too movement did happen 6 months later, it only propelled the movement further. But now, when we went back to look at the case, essentially, there is this sort of silence that's engulfed the industry. People didn't want to talk. And we wanted to kind of understand what this silence tells us, not just about the industry, but also the state and the society. And essentially, this is the sort of power that defines, this is the sort of silence that defines the powerful men, and how they can continue to exist in this ecosystem. And while we hold them accountable, my attempt with the story was also to look at how this ecosystem, which we're all part of, enables this to continue and this sort of trauma to continue to exist.
Because News Laundry has a lot of readers who perhaps are not based out of South India. Just to put Dilip in context, I don't know who to compare him to in Bollywood, because I'm not very well versed with how the industry works. Lakshmi, who do you think we can compare him? Not Shah Rukh Khan, Salman Khan, but one level down, 2 levels down. But his movies have been remade, right? His movie called Bodyguard was remade by Salman Khan.
Yeah. But I don't think there is anyone equally comparable, because there are not many actors who solely rely on humor in Bollywood, right? If there's somebody like that, I'm not sure. I can't recall anybody. But yeah, I think there's not anyone comparable like that. Quite a few quite a few films of his were remade. Shahid Kapoor acted in one of them.
Chup Chup Ke.
But then, considering his entire body of work, I don't think we can really name anybody.
So Lakshmi edited this story. I have a question for her, which is taking from what Nidhi was saying. So Nidhi said that a lot of people were perhaps not aware of the story, right? Lakshmi, while Nidhi is editing the story, you are from Kerala, you watch news all the time, you have seen the coverage through the years. But even then, were there a lot of things that you suddenly discovered because of the story?
Yes, definitely. Because the first time I think Dhanya sent it to me to do the first read, I was immediately hooked, because we start off from a particular one of the accused, and the kind of details that he goes into, what his experience was. This is an entirely different side of the story that we were not aware of, that is not in the public realm. And then there are these tiny details that you include, which kind of brings this whole situation more into a perspective that, we don't really get surface level reporting that we have been doing. Especially because the case is sub judice, there is limitations on how much details can be brought out into the public realm. So because of that, I'm guessing this is a first of its kind work that has been done with regard to this case. So it has been a revelation, actually, even as someone from Kerala, and who has been, especially as a part of TNM, who has extensively, reported on this case. It had been a surprise for me. Many parts of it had been. And Nidhi, as an excellent writer, got me immediately hooked into the story as well. That is props to her for that.
So Nidhi, who are your primary characters? The first was who Lakshmi was mentioning, a man called Manigandan. He's one of the accused in the case. He was there in the car with Pulsar Suni. In fact, he was the one who gagged Gayatri. At one point of time in the story, he tells you that he said sorry to her after the act. Who are the other characters who are primarily in this story?
So one is Manikandan. The other character is Jinsen. who shared a prison cell with Pulsar Sunni, the prime accused. And he talks, we've put some of it into the story, but we had an extensive conversation about friendships in jail. But then he's also the kind of person who immediately came out of jail and then ratted out his friend and went to the police. But that was also to keep himself safe. So he is one of the characters, and it's actually Jinsan was one of the turning points in the case, because he ended up saying that Pulsar Sunni spoke about Dilip in jail and that there was a letter written to Dilip from jail. And that sort of also led the police to look at Dilip more closely. So Jinsan is one of the characters. Manikandan is one of the characters. We obviously have Gayatri as a character through the story, even though we don't directly hear from her. It's impossible not to, have her in your mind throughout this particular piece. Dilip himself appears in the story towards the end, where we do interview him. And I personally am glad that we had his interview towards the end, because while this is about him, what he says is not necessarily new from what he's already said before, but also the positioning. He's at a place where we've already laid out the entire context of the story. And I think Pulsar Sunni's mother, for me, was a very, very interesting and almost moving character in the story, because we're looking at a woman who's brought up a man who's committed a crime that even she's not denying that he did. And then to have to live with that. And for her, it's not just about a man having done it. It's also, she feels in some way questioned as a parent, as who she's, created, basically. But also there's a love that she has for her son, which consistently comes through the conversation. And in that conversation, what's also revealed is the power dynamic between the accused as well. There is no taking away from what Pulsar Sunni did. But one can't also deny that there's a power dynamic between an accused like Dilip and the privileges he enjoys in the public realm, and someone like Pulsar Sunni. So for me, these nuances were quite interesting. And then there's also the women who stood up, and quite a few of them were almost too exhausted to even talk in this story. For me personally, that doesn't mean that they weren't part of the story or they weren't a character, because what they did and what we write about, how they've contributed to the women's movement, not just in Kerala, but it's a story about that is going to add to the women's movement in India sort of anecdote. Some of them refuse to speak because it's their personal life and it's taken a toll on them, but they continue to be there in the story in terms of what they did for this movement. So, yeah, I think these are the bigger moving parts of the story.
So before I go back to Lakshmi Priya, I want to tell all our readers and listeners that we have started an NL Sena Fund this time. Journalist Srinivasan Jain will be traveling to Israel to bring you stories from there. Remember, it's been 1 year since the war, the humanitarian crisis started, and Srinivasan Jain has had prior rich experiences of covering from Israel. And we at the News Minute and News Laundry are quite happy and proud that he will be traveling for us and doing this coverage.
Early minutes of the Hamas invasion at the site of a music festival where nearly 260 people were killed.
Israel's response has been swift. Thousands of airstrikes.
It will soon be a year since Hamas's October 7th attack, triggering the Israel-Gaza war, the worst the region has witnessed in decades.
Israel will fight until we destroy Hamas's military capabilities. That's what total victory means, and we will settle for nothing less.
The conflict has extended beyond the battlefront. Its ripples felt across the world, making it the story of our time.
Ismail Haniyeh has been killed in Iran.
President Biden will meet with his national security team as fears rise over an Iranian attack.
Yet, the Indian mainstream media has scarcely reported on this story. I will travel to Ground Zero to bring you the reality of the war and to cut through the conflicting narratives surrounding it. But we can't do this without your support. Support this News Laundry News Minute project by contributing to Gaza 1 year later. Go to newslaundry.com/Sena and help us examine the multiple dimensions of one of the biggest stories of our time.
Now back to our story. Lakshmi, Nidhi spoke about all these characters in her story, right? The editing would not have been very easy because there's a slippery slope that the story can go through, which is when you're telling the story through the eyes of Manigandan, who's one of the accused, who was in the car when the sexual assault happened. The second is Palsasuni's mother. They're all going to look at this at a prism of sympathy for themselves, right? Or for their family, what they went through. And beyond a point, as journalists, we cannot be projecting that because they also have made choices in their lives. Palsasuni had a choice, Manigandan had a choice, and they've exerted their choice also, right? So how was that editing process?
There are quite a few concerns that we had going into the story. The first is that obviously we are reporting on a sexual assault case, which we have to obviously approach in a very discreet and careful way. And second, the case is still sub judice. There are things that we can say that we can't. And the third is what you said, obviously, especially when we are bringing in perspectives of the accused specifically, and where there are certain lines that we had discussions on this, whether we can retain this, should we be retaining this, are we justifying him here, etc. And these are the places where we have to bring in our own editorialized comments, etc. So if we are to quote from the article, we are quoting Jensen. Jensen is telling us that Palsasuni used these particular words to speak to him. Palsasuni said, actually, when I was making her do it, making Gayatri go through the sexual assault, he felt bad looking at her face. But what to do, Machane, he said that he had no other choice. So this was a quote that Jensen told us. But then if we put it like that, what exactly are we saying about, I think in these situations, we need to take a stand as a sensitive, journalist first, that, Suni had a choice, and the fact that he had chosen money and his statements to the police had indicated that whatever he did was part of a deliberate deal and that he was getting payment out of it, etc. So despite the fact that he is trying to constantly assert, he's not trying to assert innocence, but he's trying to justify himself in some way, there are some points at which we have to take a clear-cut stance and not just be, that he said, she said kind of a reporter and editor, obviously. And then there are other portions where, obviously, as Nidhi said, we're extensively quoting Shobana, Palsasuni's mother, who was a very sympathetic figure, kind of, because she is positioned as a person who is not directly involved in the crime, but then people question what kind of a mother she was, that her son has gone to this extent and gone and committed such a horrific crime. But then how much empathy or sympathy do we extend her are the questions that we had to face at this point. So these were conscious decisions, obviously, that we had multiple discussions over time and decided that there were areas where we had to editorialize and bring in intent and establish that these were not helpless people stuck in a helpless situation, that they were complicit in the crime, and not Shobana specifically, but then her sympathy towards her own son can't exactly be justified in any manner. That there are instances where we have to take a stand like that. There were editorialized elements that were added into the story, definitely like that.
Nidhi, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think for me, when I was reporting the story and then you come back with all the material and you almost take a step back, you sort of dispassionately start looking at your transcripts, right? It's very different from sitting in front of someone and listening to a story. You're going through your transcripts, you're writing the story. And then when I sent it to Lakshmi and you all read it, I think one of my learnings from the editing process was also that sometimes when you're writing, and especially if it's like such a long form piece, I think the editing process really reminded me again that, okay, we are dealing with people for whom this is life, who are also going to be reading this material, who are also going to be re-traumatized in a way because we are looking at this in such close detail. And then how do we still tell the story in the most sensitive manner? For me, the editing process was kind of that learning process. Because as a writer, and we had lots of back and forth, I was quite attached to a lot of the words. I was quite attached to a lot of the sentences.
Nidhi is so attached to some of her sentences. She's like, every time we try to edit something, she'll say, but I'm very attached to it. Finally, I'm not kidding you. Yeah, no, I started logging in after midnight when I'm pretty sure Nidhi is not around. And then I would change some things and I will subtly tell her the next day morning that, look, I went to this paragraph, I made a small change. Because if I make it in front of her, she'll be like, but I'm too wedded to it. I'm too attached to it. But tell me something to the audience. One more thing I want to add is that there is no violence described in this piece. Now, that is not just about this particular story, but at the News Minute, we generally do not get into details of sexual violence. There are some stories which may demand it at that period of time. We may have put it, but I've had many examples where we have gone back and removed it. This is from my own experience as a reporter. I used to work for a television channel, for an English channel, and there was this very famous, notorious case rather, of a foreign diplomat who was accused of having raped his daughter. So the wife was a woman from Kerala, and the man works with the foreign, he's a foreigner. So after he's not arrested, basically he goes inside the consulate and he's hiding, the embassy or whatever, and he's hiding. So once you are inside the French embassy, that's French territory, right? The Indian police cannot enter. So 2 or 3 days of waiting, we were all doing what we could to actually ensure that there is justice for this child and mother. So in my overzealousness, sometimes as reporters, you can become very overzealous and become attached to this idea of justice that you have. And in that idea of justice, you often forget the protagonist is not you, it is that child or it is that woman, right? So I still remember that, and for me, in my mind, it is always that we get more justice when we have more outrage over something. When people are more outraged, they start demanding for more justice. That means the police and the courts will start working better, is my notion of justice. So what I did then was that I got the medical report of this child. And I put out all the details about, on television, because I was a TV reporter. Then it was a live, and I explained that this is the kind of torture that the child went through. And immediate reactions were very severe. People were more angry at what happened. The protests intensified and all that. After many months, that mother called me. I'm still in touch with her. The mother called me and said that I understand your intention, that you wanted to help my child, but you will move away from this case. All of us will, even I will. But that will always remain as evidence to my child that this happened to her, right? And she said, why should I awaken the conscience of an Indian sitting in some other city by explaining the violence? If I say my daughter is raped, isn't that enough for people to outrage? Why should they know the exact sexual act committed on my child to feel outraged? Then I thought to myself that as a country, do we need to know every single detail of the violence? I think that is something which was done by the Nirbhaya reporting. In the Nirbhaya case, they went to such detail about that violence. It did create a sort of national conscience, but we shouldn't have made that in our, a lot of reporting which followed after that. So Lakshmi, as an editor, how do you feel, both of you, like how do you feel about covering sexual violence, and how much should we say and how much should we not say?
So sexual assault in general is a very personal, intimate experience, and it's violence, and it's a traumatizing experience for people, obviously. So as journalists, I don't think we really have the right to take somebody's personal and experience of their violation and put it out for public to consume as such. So specifically in this case, I think a lot of the details are already in the public realm, unfortunately, and there are certain assumptions regarding what exactly happened to Gayatri in this case, what kind of sexual assault had she undergone, etc. So, but what does it matter is the question. She was violated. It's the first thing that we have to establish, and people have to understand that whatever was the extent of the violation that she went through, it's a gross injustice that happened to her. So, so I think right at the outset of the copy, we had decided that there was no way we are going into any kind of detail of what happened to her, despite it being on the public realm, at some level.
But Nidhi, some of these rules cannot apply for every story that we cover, right? Like, do you as a reporter sometimes wonder that maybe I should give more details because this is a case where people should know more? Do these thoughts come to your mind when you go cover? Because this is not the first case of sexual violence you're covering. You were there at Hathras for quite a long time covering it, right? So what are the thought processes that you go through?
We discuss this even with this story because when I met Manikandan and he went into the detail of what happened. For me, it was everything, right? The way he was explaining it, because we were just sitting and having breakfast, we were eating dosha, and he just goes into this detail of the most gruesome act that he watched through the rearview mirror, and almost in the vein of that conversation, questions her character, has his own insecurities and doubts and sorrows and feelings of betrayal, that I left that meeting thinking there's no way I can't not write about this. This is just that scene, and the way he was saying it was too much for me. The contradictions were too much not to be written. And I remember the first draft I sent to both of you had all the details. And in moments I felt like I hadn't entirely read it in this much detail before. So I did wonder, even though it's been 7 years, how come I didn't come across these exact very details? And then I realized that maybe it was also a choice, right? That this person doesn't want these details to come out. Otherwise, we live in a society where this kind of thing immediately is said. And for the first time, we were talking to a third person who's not in jail anymore and is talking about what he saw. And then it was only when we had that conversation, and I think you said, Dhanya, that, you have to remember that Gayatri is going to read this. That I actually, because until then I kept thinking that in a time when, there's so much information and there's so many things that affect and move us and overwhelm us, we're also competing or want people to kind of take notice of what happened. Because in that process of reporting, I'd also, internalized a lot of anger and rage at what was happening. And in my writing process, I was kind of trying to channelize that energy to just be like, you really have to know what's happened here. But it took me that moment when you told me that, you have to remember she's going to read this, for me to take a step back and realize that, okay, then, I really have to also now start thinking of who's going to read this and how it's going to play out for them, and how fair is it for someone's life to be put out there like this forever. Because while for us in this story, it is about this incident, I think it's also clearly unfair of us to reduce somebody just to this. And this is the kind of thing that's going to live on the internet for a long, long time. But yeah, in other cases, I have again had conversations with editors, because now feel like there are different ways to describe the incident where one doesn't have to go into the details. But often when you go to report on cases and women actually talk about the experience themselves, and when it's not cases that have already been covered by the media so many times that they know what to say, the way they describe or the way they remember the incident might not be in the exact facts that we're looking for, like in an FIR or in terms of the physical act. Women have described telling me how it felt on the floor, or the temperature of the floor, or what they were wearing, or what kind of bangles broke. And I feel like there's a way to reconstruct it without going into the grotesque and gruesome details, but staying true to how one person might have remembered and experienced it, which I feel is a more fair practice. Because I also don't know how to entirely leave it out. It's a process I'm learning, or to not fully go into the details. So I'm trying a method of looking at, how do we look at memory when we're retelling this?
Because you use the word memory, my next question is actually something to do with a memory, which is a memory card. So for those who are unaware of this case, one important part of this case is that Gayatri, the actor, is kidnapped. She's sexually assaulted. The case is that the sexual assault was videotaped. Now, it was videotaped because the police claims that Dilip wanted this tape to perhaps threaten her, blackmail her, or make fun of her, whatever it is, for his vengeance. So there is one part of the story which talks about what happened to this memory card, right? There is an altogether different case here, where now we are aware that this memory card, which was seized by the police and kept in court, was illegally accessed thrice. But that's something we don't get into too much into the story, because the story is already 14,000 words. But do you think that itself is a different story, Nidhi? That whole injustice of that memory card, right, on Gayatri. First, the crime is committed. Then there is a huge trial which is going on, which again I feel was like a second crime on her. And the third is a memory card, where she now has to constantly live under the fear whether somebody has had access to the visual, somebody has copied it, will it ever come out?
Yeah, in fact, in one of her own petitions where she talks about the pain that she goes through in the courtroom, she does say that, this is almost a second violence, a second trauma, and a second level of suffering that she's had to go through, knowing and wondering if this sort of video exists somewhere else. And even just the process of having to constantly respond and go into every detail of what happened to her in a courtroom, which took her over 15 days, over a span of 9 months, to sort of retell and be questioned about it. But the memory card, it brings into conversation this idea of even assault and something that completely violates you. There is a right to privacy and dignity there, that you have a right for this not to be put out, but then to live in the fear that it might be and someone else might have seen it is, she has described this many times as one of the most scariest things for her, and that is being heard separately in a different court. So I think, and this is also what where Balachandra Kumar, one of the whistleblowers, who, by the way, I forgot to mention earlier, is a big character in the story as well, because there was a time when the story was sort of dying down, because Dilip had come out on bail and the investigations were going on, but the media coverage had reduced.
And there was no great breakthrough in the investigation also, except for one or two things.
Yeah. And essentially because you couldn't place Dilip in the crime scene, and, there was no exact fingerprint of his in the crime. But Balchandra Kumar came out as a whistleblower in this case, and he essentially at one point was part of Dilip's circle and is a director who was at that point writing a film that Dilip was producing and supposed to act in. But he then came and told in a media interview with Reporter TV, that he was part of a conversation where Dilip was sitting with his friends and family members and allegedly watching the video, which Balchandra Kumar had then audio recorded on his own tab. And he gave these audio tapes to the channel and eventually to the police. And then the probe was sort of, they had extended time to investigate this further. And then Dilip did kind of have a more central role in this particular investigation. So even just this idea that, right, now that there might be other people who have seen it, can be such a scary thought for someone who's gone through it. I think there's so many levels of fear here. Often when we report, we kind of report on this extraordinary act of violence and then forget that this process of justice, or that's supposed to be a healing process, can itself traumatize you further.
So Lakshmi, I'll just come to you before we wrap up the discussion. While we were editing Nidhi's story, one thing which struck me was that how much has happened? How much has happened? Like, I had forgotten half the things that we ourselves had reported. For example, yes, the crime happens. Then what is the fallout in the industry? That itself is a story, right? The WCC is formed, how the other actors react to it, how the big superstars like Mammootty, Mohanlal of Malayalam cinema act to it, how do the younger actors react to it. That forms a different tangent altogether. Then in between, you have all these witnesses from the film industry turning hostile, right? Next is when Balachandra Kumar enters a scene as a whistleblower. Again, another round of raids happen, phones are seized, we are inundated with audio calls. For example, Dilip's brother talking to his lawyer, Dilip's lawyer talking to somebody else. And in all this, the memory card issue surfaces, where we understand that the memory card has been illegally accessed. So my question to you, Lakshmi, is that, first, I want to go back to the memory card itself, because we had discussed we should do a more detailed story on how the court itself has played so many games in this. There are judges who have recused themselves, because nobody in the High Court wants to actually pin responsibility on whoever was the judge at that time in the court where this memory card was kept. So the story is not just about an actor and the violence which was inflicted on her. There's also a bigger story at play, right? How power behaves, how courts can then behave.
Yeah, exactly. So this was kind of a surreal experience coming at it from that point, because as you said, as a Malayali and as a journalist, this is a case that I think many of us have been very invested in over time. But then we are not people who are living this story. We are not inside it. We are still looking at it from the outside. So the perspective that we have is like on and off. We come across a new news article and we publish it, obviously. We move on with our life. And then suddenly everything is put together on a doc, and this is exactly what goes on in your mind. This has been going on for so many years, and there are people in it living this reality, like Gayatri especially. And there are so many people who have been affected. A ripple effect went on. It created a resistance of sorts. And then that resistance died down, unfortunately, forcefully buried somehow. A lot of things have happened over the time. And this story, I think that is exactly the point of the story in the first place, to give you that perspective of how this one incident had triggered all of this and made such a fundamental shift in Malayalam film industry of sorts. Like the headline itself says, it unmasked the Malayalam film industry. So the perspective that it gives, I think it is the biggest factor that this story brings in. And also, I think Dhanya mentioned to me at one point, we are people who are inside it, in the sense that at least we have been aware of exactly what has been going on at every point, from 2017 to when the memory card issue came up. But then as someone who, is not aware of the case, I think I especially have to mention Nikita Saxena, who works with Nidhi. She had come in at some point into the editing process, and she brought in a completely different perspective to the story.
Because unlike the three of us, she was not a Malayali and she was not aware of the case.
Yes, exactly. So I think a lot of what we know, we take it for granted because this is something that happens around us. We are like, okay, this is normal. But when somebody looks at it from another point of view, from a third-person point of view, I think clearly, as Nikita, gave a lot of suggestions at that point, she brought in completely different points of view. Like
simple things like she would ask things like, for example, we would say Dilip was married to another actor, Kavya Madhavan. In our minds, everybody knows Dilip, everybody knows Kavya Madhavan, right? Exactly. So she'll ask, who's Kavya Madhavan? Put perspective there. Even very, very simple things, because when you are inside a story, as readers, as reporters, you understand. But I always tell reporters in the News Minute, we are all like frogs in a well. Sometimes we are in a Kochi well, sometimes we are in a Kerala well, sometimes in a Tamil Nadu well. You actually don't know what is happening just outside your well, right? Yeah, so that definitely, Nikita brought that thing. I want to ask both of you one question and then wrap it up. Maybe Lakshmi first, then we'll allow Nidhi to conclude Reporters Without Orders.
Yeah, but I also have a question for the both of you.
Okay, you can ask that then.
I actually had a question because this has now been out on News Minute for 2 weeks. And we've put it out on News Laundry now. I was looking at comments, people have been writing in. One of the questions and things that people have said so far is, how are you reporting first on a case that's sub judice? Don't you all think you're biased? Aren't you painting a particular person in a certain way before even the case has been concluded? And I wanted to actually ask, what do you all say to that? How do you all respond to that?
See, for me, the answer is also personal, because I interact with Gayatri and a lot of other characters in the women who fought, especially, not anybody else in this case. But let me, to those who are asking, are you not creating a bias? There is nothing in life that is not biased. From, when I wake up in the morning and as a journalist, there are 3 stories in front of me. For example, there is a building that has fallen down. There is a politician who has said something, and there is a protest happening. Which do I cover? In what I choose, there is a bias, right? So there is all human beings are biased, all journalists are biased. Now, when we report a story like this, how do we present everybody's side, right? That's a question that you ask. For that, we have asked Dilip the question. We have presented his side. But the point is, a story is not just about presenting all sides. A and B are not equal in every story. A, B and C are not at all equal in every story. So that is where a journalist perspective comes in, where you give A, B and C's perspective, but you also know how much weightage to give to A, to B or C. And in your reporting, you explain that to people. Now, this is a sub judice case. There is a gag order saying that you cannot get into the trial. You cannot report the proceedings of the trial, and we have stayed away from it. We are not reporting on the trial at all. But I think this story does require attention, because for 7 years, it has been going on. The trial was delayed, I think, because Dilip himself has filed almost 60 petitions in court. He kept filing petition after petition for quashing FIR, for this, for a long time, for getting the memory card. I mean, getting the visuals, right? It was only in 2020 or 21, I forgot now, that the trial started. And then there is again a delay because there's a second FIR being filed after Balachandra Kumar comes in. So there have been inordinate delays. And then there is a segment of injustice here to that victim from the court itself, where the memory card has been illegally accessed by someone. So it's not like the crime has stopped after Feb 2017. It has gone on. In many different versions, there has been injustice to this woman even after 2017. So it's not just about that one crime, right? It is about how lawyers have interfered. It is about whether witnesses have been manipulated. It is about, did the memory card actually get leaked? And we can't just say that, oh, the case is in trial, so we will not report about it because it will prejudice. There are people who are already working behind the scenes to prejudice this case in one way or the other. So why should we as journalists not be reporting on that?
Well, obviously, I don't have to differ with you on that. But yeah, as a journalist, I think it is very important to take a stand in cases like this, especially. And also, I don't think we have, specifically judged anyone much here. All of what we have reported is everything is in the public realm.
Correct. Including Dileep's motives, we have not made up anything. We have just stuck to what the cops have said.
Everything is attributed to the police, or the statements, or whatever has been reported based on the court's petitions, etc. So it's not like we have gone out of our way to attribute or ascribe, cast aspersions at anyone at this point. But at the same time, as journalists, there are certain points in a story where we have to take a stand as well and bring in our editorialized opinions into it. When people try to wash their hands of something horrible that happened, etc. So I think that is what we are, right? That is what we represent as journalists in the first place.
To my long answer, which might have confused people, what I mean to say is that to all those people asking us, are you not biased? They only keep Dileep as that central focus, right? That this story is perhaps against Dileep. Dileep is not our only focus. Dileep is one part of the story according to us. I am saying there have been injustices where the court itself should have done better investigation into who leaked the memory card, etc. I'm saying that when witnesses were turning hostile, questions should have been asked. I mean, if they did turn hostile, the prosecution is saying so. So for us, Dileep is not the only character, right? How the industry reacted, the patriarchal reactions from the industry, that forms a part of our story.
And beyond that, the Hema committee report, how it was buried, how the state government is accountable, etc.
Exactly. So there are many culprits here. There are many people that we are pointing fingers at, many people we are questioning. So now, one thing that a lot of people have been commenting, not just about the bias, it's about why is the story behind the paywall? Why can't you give free access to the story? In fact, somebody even told me you're commodifying rape. I got really angry at that because first thing, as people who are listeners of News Laundry or News Minute, you have known for years that there is no other way that we can survive and sustain independent journalism, but without viewers or readers chipping in, right? And it's also respect for somebody's work. Nidhi has worked for so many months on this and then finally written the story. There are people who sat on the edit and there are people who did all those illustrations. So there's a whole team which has worked behind the story. It's not just one person. So we pay for a coffee. We pay for OTT. We pay for popcorn in the movie theater. We pay for a doctor. We pay for a lawyer. These are vocations. In one way, if you call it, they are not professions, they are vocations. Journalism is also a vocation. So I asked all those people, when I wrote 300 stories in the News Minute about this case, and Google had Coca-Cola ads on the page, that time it was not commodifying. When the ad is there on the page, nobody's bothered. That can be any ad. It can even be a Dileep movie ad. That nobody thinks is commodifying. But the moment the reader is asked to pay, so I think that's a very wrong way to look at it. I mean, I also wish that stories were not behind paywalls. But unfortunately, that's the way we are now. We are an ad-free platform. We need people to actually subscribe and read. And it's one way of you telling us that we like your work, we value your work, and we want you to do more of that work, right? So that's my, Abhinandan would be very proud of me for this speech on paywalls, I think. My final question to Nidhi, Lakshmi, I'll come to you first for that. A lot of people who are not living in Kerala are now quite knowledgeable about Kerala because they watch Malayalam movies a lot. And they love Fahad Fazil, Dulquer Salman, Sai Pallavi, Parvati, and so many people that they see in the popular movies, right? But this story, this whole incident shows how patriarchal that industry is. So how do you explain this contradiction to the audience who are watching and listening to you now?
So yes, Malayalam cinema is definitely getting some very level popularity right now. But that said, I think there are bad and good apples in every industry. First, let's just acknowledge that and mention that not all Malayalam films are good also. It's the best of the lot that goes outward. There are maybe it is likely that there are slightly more good films than compared to some other industries. But then we can't assume that every film that Malayalam cinema makes is amazing or something. There are still horribly patriarchal stuff that is going on, misogynistic comments and jokes and whatnot. And many of these do not go outside of the realm that we are in, luckily. But yeah, this is the reality that we have to accept. And this has been the reality all the time. So I think despite the fact that Malayalam films are seeing this, glorified kind of an era, because as Kerala or even as an industry, we are rooted in a very patriarchal, a very misogynistic, a male-dominated culture. And I don't think it is easy for us to get out of that. I think the whole Avalkoppa movement that we went through was a very hard try at it. But then even maybe we succeeded to an extent because we started, having a conversation about it at least. But then there are certain limits to, how much we can push it also, because there is a hard pushback that comes against it. So I think like every other thing in the world, Malayalam cinema is filled with contradictions, obviously. And it is our job as journalists to bring that out also, especially since, there is this particular image of Malayalam cinema that the world has, the nation has right now. And it is important to understand that there is this other side to it as well. Even Dilip's films, more recent films, some of it are quite crass, if I can say so. It's not like people are not very familiar with Dilip. Dilip or many other actors are not part of this new age Malayalam cinema realm that, has gone out of Kerala. But then there is this other side that exists to it as well. So I think we have to look at it from that perspective as a whole.
So Aval Koppam, which Lakshmi was mentioning, is a movement. It's basically with her, Aval Koppam. Nidhi, what do you think? In fact, there is a line in your story, right? That for people outside of Kerala who are now enjoying Malayalam movies, there also remains that one part of Malayalam cinema, the people who make these movies, who have made reactions that have shocked many of us. Like while covering the story, I would be shocked by the kind of things that they said.
Yeah, I think, I've been living now in Delhi for the last 4 to 5 years, and I keep hearing how much people here now, because of OTT and everything, they love Fahad Fasil and love Malayalam cinema. And of course, it also gives this perception that there's a very educated and progressive and feminist community down in Kerala and down south and away from UP and Haryana. And of course, it is very, very different. And the stakes are very different in both the spaces. But I do find myself constantly explaining and also struggling to explain why there is so much contradiction and misogyny and patriarchy in Kerala. I think there's a lot of conversation of feminism and there's language. But then there's also men who are able to use this language to further abuse and to further and to continue that sort of misbehavior, armed with this kind of feminist language. And one thing that I sort of realized, and we were looking at in this story, was that yes, now a lot of new films are coming out, but the reality is that there is now a market for feminist films, but the feminists who stood up and caused a revolution and led the revolution in Kerala and the feminist movement are still struggling for work. And that says something, right? That they have paid a price for speaking up. And the essence of that is that it's still a deeply patriarchal and deeply misogynistic society where women are expected to talk a certain way, act a certain way, say things a certain way. Even if they're saying things that men may disagree with, there's a certain way to do it. So I agree with the fact that it's not in the same... You can't compare it to a UP or a Haryana or even Punjab and places like that. And yes, there's a lot that Kerala is much ahead of. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there is still so much patriarchy and misogyny. And I find it a little scary when society is armed with feminist language. And then it's like you can't tell where the patriarchy is rooted. Sometimes it's easier when you know the beast you're up against, as opposed to someone who is armed with this language and can manipulate it. So I find it very scary. It's a very tricky situation to navigate.
In fact, another editor, I'm not using her name because I didn't ask permission, but after reading the story, she called me and said that great story. And she was telling me that she loves Kerala, she loves the weather, she loves the food. But whenever she thinks of relocating from Delhi and living somewhere else, Kerala does not strike her as a place to go. She's not a Malayali. She doesn't want to go there because she finds that even in her small visits, she has found people to be patriarchal. And she told me, why is there no long story about why is Kerala like that? So perhaps a new story idea for both of you. A deep piece into why is there so much patriarchy, right? And reactions which are very unexpected from people. So anyways, we'll wrap this discussion, Reporters Without Orders. I kept thinking it's Reporters Without Borders, which is also in one way correct, but Reporters Without Orders. Do read the story and remember what I told you about the paywall. Let that not be an inhibition or an obstruction for you. And before we wrap up, Lakshmi, any recommendations for people listening, watching, what to read, what to watch, etc. Nidhi?
Okay, I think I'll suggest an article that I read today before the heartbreaking disqualification of Vinesh Phogat happened. I was just reading Sharda Ugra's article on ESPN. ESPN on the whole, I read 3 articles on Vinesh Phogat's victory, which were beautiful. I think Sharda Ugra's article was "It's Vinesh Phogat's world. We are lucky to be part of it." And then there was, I think, Shyam Vasudevan's piece on "Fought with heart, fought with head" or something like that. So beautiful coverage on her about how she has reached this point, how much of a champion she is, and despite what she had to go through over the past year or so, and all that. And then immediately this disqualification happened, and I had been tearing up for an hour or so in the morning. But yeah, I think those are really good reads, especially after what happened.
Yeah, Nidhi?
Yeah, I think that, so because we spoke about the story, I had read quite a few things when I was writing this story. One was this ProPublica piece called The Unbelievable Rape story, which was also then made into a Netflix film. But the story itself is also a very long piece, but extremely well written on how to report when, characters and narrators and people that you're speaking to are unreliable. But that doesn't mean that they're lying, because often memory is unreliable and memory is not linear, but kind of weaving a story of crime, which is also extremely factual, but having and making space for this sort of unreliable narrative to also exist, because it is very real. So I think that was an excellent piece. I also enjoyed reading Ken Aletta's book on Weinstein. It's a profile that he did, which is a book, and he kind of looks at the crime, but also contextualizes him, not in a way that pardons him in any form, but what the making of a man like him, which I thought was excellent. And Vinesh Phogat's own article at The Express, which she wrote during the protest against Brij Bhushan and the assault, where she expressed enough grit and a lot of grace and dignity in how they were conducting the protest and why they chose to protest at all. I think these 3 things is what I want to recommend.
So because you were talking about the book on Weinstein, I think She Said is a good read. Even Ronan Farrow's book is a good read. I would like to suggest Neha Dikshit's new book that's just out, The Many Lives of Saida X. Read it. Neha is a fantabulous reporter, and this is about a displaced Muslim woman. So do try to read the book, and stay tuned to the News Laundry and News Minute. A lot of amazing work is lined up, and don't forget to read Nidhi's article, An Orchestrated Nightmare, an Incident That Unmasked Malayalam Cinema. Thank you all for joining us.
Journalism at News Laundry is powered by the public, because when the public pays, the public is served. Visit newslaundry.com/subscription and pick a payment plan of your choice. Pay to keep news free and independent. Your future, and indeed the future of democracy, depends on it.